Hey, Chef Daniel. We'll let a few more people drop in and then we'll get the show started. Teresa. So nice to see you guys. Thank you for joining me. Welcome to today's episode of the Dough Doctor. I'm Chef Colette. I'm your host and baking expert, and I have a great show planned for you today. Well, honestly, guys, we always have a great show, but I think today's show is going to be especially good. So, let's get started. We had some really good questions drop in today, or actually not today, yesterday, and then a couple follow-ups came in early today. So yesterday and today. Anyhow, I will learn to talk, I promise. So this question, which is totally relevant to what we've been doing, came from our baker, Witty Critty. And Witty asks, and this is a stunner, so just wait for it. She said, how long is best to blind bake the bottom before doing a 2-crust pie? Now, just to recap from last week, our baker Patty asked a great question about soggy bottom crusts. You all know it, that soggy pie crust, unbaked, under our fillings. What do we do about that? So Witty jumped on that bandwagon, and I'm so glad that she did, because it's a great question. And I don't have good news. I know I normally have good news. I normally have the answer, but let's break it down. So when we blind bake a pie crust, what happens is we set the baking process is in motion. The starch is gelatinized in the flour. The crust begins to form, and we can stop there because that's the problem. When we blind bake a pie crust or a tart crust, it takes at least 20 minutes for those processes to start to kick in so that you notice a change in your crust. It goes from raw looking to opaque, and maybe a little bit of golden brown on the edge. It's set. So the problem with a 2-crust pie is if we were to par bake the bottom and then top it with raw crust, then we're wrapping raw dough around a partially baked edge, and that is a bit of a problem. So the problem is the dough that's under the raw, the partially baked dough that's under the raw dough is going to really kind of go into dough shock. If there's such a thing as dough shock, it's going to be like, oh my God, what do I do? There's raw dough on top of me. So the top dough would have to heat up, and that heat would have to penetrate to the partially baked crust to finish it, which is why you don't see it. And that's why we say things like, put crumb topping on the bottom. There's a ton of, well, no, that's a lie. There's a ton of, no, I'm lying again. There are a few tips and tricks we can do to encourage that bottom crust of a 2-crust pie to start baking without blind or par baking it. And let's just clear this up right now. Par baking is when we take a pie or tart crust and we bake it part of the way. And we're either going to fill it, top it, and get it back in the oven. So it's going to have more baking time, okay? Now, blind baking is taking it all the way, the whole enchilada. You're baking it fully, and you're going to let it cool, and then you're going to fill it with a custard or something, mousse, chocolate mousse, whatever. Whatever you're filling the fully baked crust with is already completely cooked. This is not going back in the oven. So that's the difference. And that is exactly Marathon Baguette. You got it. Don't lie. So that's the difference. Par baking, the pie's going back in the oven. Blind baking, that's a full-on bake. We should call it full bake, not blind bake. Maybe that's what we'll start in 2022. Are you going to full bake that crust or par bake that crust? Partially bake that crust. So, Witty, I don't have a great answer for you. I have some suggestions. Again, that streusel topping in the bottom. I did a deep dive last night researching, going back to the experts, some of them long dead, to see what they said on the subject. I got graham crackers, breadcrumbs, and then my old chestnut streusel topping. So, okay, I feel like I'm in the league of extraordinary bakers with giving you this information. I think crumb topping's the best. Graham crackers can be problematic. And then breadcrumbs, that doesn't quite sit with me. Just a nice crumb topping that'll meld into our filling, kind of marry those flavors together. They're like flavors. That's a good match. The other thing you can do is bake the pie initially toward the bottom of the oven. Now you all know my trick of, well, maybe you don't all know, I'm not going to assume, but when you bake your pies, preheat a baking sheet and then drop your pie on the hot baking sheet. And it's really good if it's lined with foil or parchment paper. And if you're really worried about it, start it at 425, set the timer for 10 minutes, and then turn the temperature down to 400. Give it another 10 minutes on that, close to the bottom of the oven. Some experts even said the floor of the oven. No. That's a problem. That's really hot. And then so we've got 10 minutes at 425, reduce to 400, and then 10 more minutes and move it up just a little bit so its poor little bottom isn't so close to the heat. Because what you've got to know is when we're baking, and we see this with cakes and cupcakes, not only does the bottom get caramelized and brown, but the sides do too. So we can't leave the pie too close to the bottom of the oven for too long. But that's going to encourage the bottom crust to set and begin to bake all the way through to the filling, and then that way we don't have to par bake it and have true, and I mean true, baking awkwardness trying to drape raw dough over a partially baked pie. Disaster. You can always default to like a French apple pie, or sometimes they're called Dutch apple pie. There's one posted on my website right now from last week's lesson. It'll stay up. It'll stay up through Monday. There won't be a new post. And I have a lovely, lovely recipe for a crumb-topped, streusel-topped apple pie. So you can do that. That's totally fine. You could do a partial crumb topping and then maybe do some cutouts of pie crust if you've got some groovy cutters like acorns and maple leaves or little baby pumpkins, and put those on the top. Something, I know it's backwards, I apologize you guys, but some little fancy cutouts. I love doing stuff like that. So those are some ideas. So Witty, that is the skinny on par baking two crust pies. It's a slippery slope, so it's better to manipulate temperature and oven placement and put it on a ripping hot baking sheet. put that baking sheet in the oven when you preheat your oven, and preheat for 20 minutes. I mean, you guys know your ovens. You know how long they take to preheat. Give it a good preheat. And always line, because fillings like to burble over, burn on your tray. And who wants to spend the night before Thanksgiving scrubbing a baking pan? There's enough scrubbing going on the next day and the day after we celebrate. Okay? Did that generate any questions? Let's see. Nope, you all seem like you're good. That's awesome. Okay, so that was that question. Now, for a new segment in the DoughDr show, a new segment I'm going to call Alternative Baking Facts. All right? We could have called them Old Wives' Tales of Baking, but that didn't seem very proper, so I'm going to call them Alternative Baking Facts. I hear them all the time, and this first one is a doozy. I heard this week, and I was like, no, that's wrong. So bakers, this is yeast. This is instant yeast that I store in my freezer. The alternative baking fact that I heard was that if you open your yeast container and you can't smell the yeast, it's dead. I was like, what? No. The yeast, commercial yeast that we buy, is actually good for years. And the smell of the yeast has nothing, and I mean nothing, to do with its freshness. And when it's stored in the freezer, it loses its pungency. It's totally fine. So if anyone ever says that to you, it's wrong, dead wrong. The only way yeast can be bad is if it sits for a couple of years. Let's say after the zombie apocalypse, if it sits in a cupboard for 4 years and somebody tries to make bread with it, well, it's probably not going to work. But if you when you buy your yeast, you'll see the expiration date is usually 1.5 to 2 years out. So rest assured, bakers, and one last note about yeast, as far as freshness, you can store it in the freezer, you can store it in the fridge once you open it, and then I think I've told you this, I do bake all my own bread. It's part of my self-care to make sure I get good solid nutrition in my little body. So I bake all my own bread, and so I don't have to dig into the freezer. I do keep a small jar of yeast in my baking cupboard, but I'm baking a lot. So if you're baking a lot, maybe split up some so you don't have to dig in your freezer, and then keep the bulk of it in your freezer. All right, bakers, do we have any questions about that? We have a comment, Love from 512. She says, love the smell of yeast. And I say, amen. I love the smell of yeast too. It's just alive. And I think that's what's so exciting about when we make a yeasted dough and we see that yeast begin to work, and the fact that it needs exactly what we need: love, warmth, moisture, and nutrition. Go yeast. All right, our last alternative baking fact for the day, because I'm watching the clock and I know I've got to sail into demo in 60 seconds. See, I'm practicing when I have an earpiece, and then, because I'm manifesting, you guys. I'm manifesting that we're going to take this show and it's going to go big, because we're not going home, right? So anyhow, the other alternative baking fact for this week is salt kills yeast. Now I bet there's many of you in the audience, you just sucked your breath in, because you were told that. I might have told you that in a culinary class, because that's what we used to believe back in the day. Guess what? No. The only thing that kills yeast is heat. Cold slows it down. Cold can throw it into shock if it's mixed with water that's too cold, like under 50 degrees. The yeast can go all like, I'm not moving. You know, just like if we were thrown into a cold swimming pool or a cold lake. But salt does not kill it. What salt does is that it slows it down, way down. And it can compromise a percentage of the yeast cells so they just don't multiply and do what they need to do. But absolute killing it, The only thing that absolutely, once again, is heat. When the yeast hits 138 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, it's done. And when it gets, if you're baking a loaf of bread, when that internal temperature hits 138 to 140, whoop, it stops. That's it. And then the other baking processes that we were talking about earlier, starches gelatinizing, sugars caramelizing, crust forming, blah, 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 that's when they all kick in and you get your beautiful loaf of bread. I see some former students in the audience. Thank you guys so much for joining. And now we're going to move on to demo. And thank you, Witty, for that great question to start us off. We covered 2 alternative baking facts. Really excited about that segment for the show. So now that we're completely into our pies, I want to talk about how to cut apples for baking. And you guys can see my work surface. I'm just checking camera to make sure. And there's, well, maybe a couple more myths to debunk. And pop in questions as you, if you have questions. So I'm talking apple pies. The all-American apple pie, probably for Thanksgiving, the second favorite. And then there's pecan and sweet potato, or maybe sweet potato or pecan. I don't know the polls. I haven't seen the polls for 2022, so who knows. But a lot of times we cut the apples into slices. And sometimes those slices are thin, and sometimes they're thick, because a lot of times, this is when we're baking for Thanksgiving, you may only be making a couple apple pies a year. So I'm going to show you how to cut your apples so that you can do it very easily, and you'll have nice chunks that fit on a fork and that are they're evenly sized so they bake up evenly in your pie. Because those slices that are too thin, they turn into sauce in the oven, and if they're too thick, they don't fully bake. Now, you can also do this technique with an apple corer, but I happen to, I lost my apple corer, so I'm going to use a knife, but I'm going to talk you through it if you're using an apple corer. All right, so the first thing you're going to do is you're going to peel the apple, and you're going to take your peeler, and you're going to make sure the bottom is flat so that it's stable. Then you're going to take your knife. I've got this is my original, this is from my first cooking job, my little Gerber. They don't even make them anymore. And I'm going to cut the apple right in half. Now, you might have this tool in your kitchen utensil drawer, from when you were going to make that watermelon basket. You remember, this is called a melon baller, or a Parisian scoop. And what we're going to do is we're going to use it to take out the center and the little stems of the apple. Now, I hear you're saying, I don't have that. I don't have that tool. What am I going to use? You're going to grab your teaspoons And you're going to use the teaspoon to do exactly the same thing. But I like to use this because I think we forget that we have it. All right, now watch. I'm going to scoop out the center, and I have my compost bowl here. Oh, by the way, I've been putting some sustainable baking tips. You may see them on Wednesday. Here's something you may not know. The stickers on fruit are not compostable. So take them off, put them in the garbage, don't add them to your compost or your community compost, okay? All right, and then you just get rid of the little stem end. So we get rid of this. And you can do all your apples, work like an assembly line, guys. Do each task. Okay, and then flat side down, we're going to cut the apple lengthwise in half. Then we're going to cut each half in half. Then watch. I give it a quarter turn. You're like, we're always turning everything a quarter turn. Apples too. And I kind of shore up the sides. And then I cut the half apple in half. And so this half apple is in 8 pieces. All right? So let's do that again. In half lengthwise. Look, my hands are not anywhere near the blade. So you, in half lengthwise, each half in half, kind of just shore up the apple, straighten everything out, eyeball center, and go. That's it. Now, the average apple pie, this size, takes 6 to 7 apples. So you're going to have this whole bowl full of apples. And everybody worries about their apples over browning at this point because there's an enzyme in apples and pears and flour. That's why doughs can turn gray if you leave them in the refrigerator too long. And this enzyme causes the apple to begin to oxidize. It's called enzymatic browning. It's normal, it's natural, but we don't like it. So you hear all sorts of craziness like, put your apples in lemon water. Well, they're sponges. They're going to get soggy, and that's gross. Or do this. Just take the lemon juice that you have in your fridge and sprinkle it over your cut apples and toss. Whoops. And then they'll sit for a while without getting too brown. And bakers, we're going to saute them probably and cook the filling a little bit, and then we're going to bake them. So don't worry about a little enzymatic browning, but please keep them out of lemon water. That's only good if you're using raw apples, like on a salad, and you're working as a line cook at Panera. Then you would have them in lemon water, but not for our baking purposes, okay? All right. That's it. You don't have to have fresh lemon, but of course, if you have access to lots of lemons, just use fresh lemon juice. But, so that's that. Any questions? Drop in those questions. And now, before we go on to the next thing, I wanted to show you something because I had that apple already peeled, but I love to show you things you might not know. So bakers, if you dig your peeler out, maybe you're cooking dinner, maybe you're peeling apples for your pie, and it's just a regular old-fashioned peeler, you can sharpen it on the honing steel from your knife block and give it a little new life. Just like that. So put it in the comments if you like that tip. All right, now we're going to roll out some pie crust because we made that pie dough last week. I froze it and I thawed it overnight. Oh wow, it's still really, really cold. Yikes! Oh, that's all right. I'll make it work. It's a make it work moment. Where's Tim Gunn when we need him? All right, so now I was expecting a question about pie pans. All right, so I just wanted to say many of you love, and I do too, a glass pie pan because we can see if the crust is baking. But remember, these don't really take too well to super high heat. So that 425 I was talking about earlier, that would be better if you're in a metal pan. When I use my disposable pans, which I use over and over and over, I mean these are a couple years old, I double them up in the oven. All right, you guys, there's going to be some banging because this dough is cold. You know what? I'm going to show you something crazy. I just threw it in the microwave on the defrost setting for 15 seconds, and we're going to be good to go. Yes, you can do that. I didn't plan it, but you can do it. Yeah, that's perfect. See, you never need to panic. Just watch the show, and you know something's going to happen, and you'll see something, and you'll go, oh, she did that. I can do that too. You just don't want to leave it in there very long. All right, that was 15 seconds on the defrost setting. So now this is a rectangle, and I'm going to roll it out into a circle. So I'm going to just kind of bang the sides to try to get it a little bit more oval or round. Put it in the comments if you would have been too scared to put it in the microwave. Put it in the comments. All right, now, if you have one of those fabulous mats with circles on them to roll out your dough, dig it out and use it. I do not, so I'm going to show you how to do it without the fancy. All right, ideally we want our bottom crust to be a scant 1/4 inch. Tati, right? Tatiana? I know, definitely scary, but you saw me do it. It was just 15 seconds. When it's just too hard to roll out and you're pressed for time, take a deep breath, be brave, throw it in the mic. So I bang it first. Sorry, I should have warned you. I bang it first so that I'm not developing gluten. And then once I get it about a 1/2 inch thick, I start rolling. And once it begins to cooperate, I'll give it a 1/4 turn. And we don't want to have it swimming in flour. And Yellow Kelly, she said she would have been scared to put it in the microwave too. See, I'm glad that happened. It just enhances the learning. So the thing with pies, everyone, the crust is thicker, we have a lot of crust. We have a top crust or not. Maybe we're doing a one crust pie with crumb topping. But a pie crust, we have the edge which we fold over. So honestly, another bit of success, just going back to the beginning, calling back to the beginning of the show, if you are doing a double crust pie and you want to eliminate the soggy bottom, because really people don't like it that much. Nobody says anything, but you know, it's not always, it can taste a little raw. Go thinner on your bottom crust. Give that crust a chance to bake through. So what I do, you saw me, I roll, whoops, really sticking today. I roll back and forth. I give it a quarter turn. Back and forth. I give it a quarter turn. I don't have a ton of flour on this board. As we always say, we want to work with the flour, not in the flour. But you got to make sure that it's not sticking, okay? And then if it gets a little rectangle or weird, then just go on a diagonal. And that will help round it out. Okay? Oh, okie dokie. What'd I do with that paper? And now we want to have at least 3/4 of an inch. So I have the pan centered. I want to have at least 3/4 of an inch overhang. And because I'm going to fold it under. And then also we have to compensate for the fact that it's got to fit in the pan. So please, bakers, do not cut it to the rim of the pan, because that's going to be a problem. If you want some leeway, go an inch out. We can always trim. All right. I'm using a pastry wheel or a pizza cutter. My baking students will be like, oh yeah, a pastry wheel. But a pastry wheel and a pizza cutter are one in the same. So there's my circle. A pie pan is never greased. I repeat, a pie pan is never greased. And the great thing about pie dough is we can move it. It's not like tart dough, which gets all fragile. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it in half and then fold it in quarters. I'm going to grab my pan. I can see the center of my pan. I'm going to line it up. I'm going to open it, flip everything open like this. And then I'm going to make sure, see bakers, you've got to have the dough flat against the side of the pan. If there's a gap, then it's going to shrink down. Okay? So you gotta flatten it. You can put some flour on your fingers. Okay? Flatten against the sides. And I'm missing my scissors. That's all right. And then, so see, it's really fitting nicely. And then we're going to fold the edge under. You want to make sure it's folded under. You don't want to have you don't want it to be open, because that'll open up during the bake and it's going to look weird. So fold it under, you know. You can trim if you like. I might have trimmed a little if I could find my scissors, but they seem to have left the building. And remember to, well, speaking of those scissors that have left the building, remember to periodically refresh your kitchen scissors, unless you have some kind of incredible pair that, you know, is incredible. All right, great. This looks great. I'm really happy with it. I've got a nice edge, Everything's tucked under. See, you can see it doesn't look like this. This we don't want. We don't want it to be halfway. Make sure to tuck it under. Lay it on the lip of the pan. And for today's pie, I'm going to show you how to do a shell, which is so pretty. And I would say the #1 favorite of all my students from all time. So I put a little flour on my thumb and forefinger. I want to make sure you can see this. And then I'm just going to pinch the side and kind of rotate my hand to the center of the pie. Just like that. So it's a pinch and a twist. A pinch and a twist. You'll get, and then just go all the way around. And you know what? If you're not happy with your first results, you can flatten it out and try again. It's all practice. And I will tell you, the baking processes, they take over, so even your best efforts might be not as crisp as when you put it in the oven. But there's a few things you can do. You can chill the pie like this overnight before filling in baking. That will help you, that will help set your beautiful work. So that's one thing that you can do, and I highly recommend that. All right? Well, bakers, thank you so much for joining me today on the DoughDr. Next week, I'm going to show you how to make caramel apples for Halloween, because next week is our Halloween weekend. Any questions that come up throughout the week, let me know, and I look forward to seeing you next week right here on the DoughDr at noon Pacific. Thank you for joining me. Happy baking!